Hey there. Welcome to Dark Lullabies. How was your day? I'm so glad you're here, and I really hope I can help you relax and find some peace tonight. Before we start, make sure to like and subscribe to the channel, and leave a comment with where you're from and what time you're watching. That way, YouTube will keep showing you stories just like this one. Okay, let's get started with the first story. Story 1. I don't live the kind of life people make movies about. But whenever someone asks me for the scariest thing that's ever happened to me, this is the story I tell. My name's Aaron, and I was 15 that summer, right before sophomore year, living in a little Appalachian town tucked between two ridgelines where the fog sits low in the mornings and the hollows carry every sound twice as far as they should. We weren't a resort town or anything like that, just an old coal community that had been shrinking for as long as I could remember. By then, most of the mines were shut down. Half the storefronts on Main Street were empty. And at night, the only real light came from the gas station and the blinking red tower on the far ridge. I used to tell people that if you stood outside after midnight and held your breath, you could hear the whole valley breathing with you, the creek, the crickets, the distant hum of trucks on the interstate that cut through the next mountain over. Our house sat up on a little rise at the edge of town, just high enough that you could see the road snaking through the hollow and the railroad trestle that crossed the creek, like an old spine of gray wood and rusted steel. As cliché as it sounds, that place is stitched into who I am. We don't live in that exact house anymore, but it's still in the family, and every time I go back, it feels like walking into a memory someone forgot to turn off. At the time, I was on the varsity cross-country team and obsessively serious about staying in shape, even in the off-season. Summers in our part of Appalachia were heavy and humid, the kind of heat that didn't just sit on your skin, but climbed into your lungs. So I usually ran either before the sun was fully up or after it went down behind the ridge. Nights were my favorite. The air cooled off, the fireflies came out, and the whole hollow felt like it belonged only to me. My parents were strict in a quiet, stubborn way, and one thing they never budged on was locking the house. Every door, every window, every time. It had started years earlier after a string of weird break-ins along the back roads. Nothing huge, but enough to unsettle people. Tools missing from sheds, screen doors found open, a couple of dogs poisoned. Nobody was ever arrested, at least not that I remember. After that, my mom double-checked the deadbolts every night, and my dad started keeping a shotgun in the bedroom closet. So even when I went for a run, I had to take my house keys with me. Non-negotiable. The keys themselves were on this little metal tag with our last name and address engraved into it, something my mom said would help if we ever lost them. Ironically, that detail is what makes this story so much worse. One August night, I decided to go for a late run. It'd been up too late the night before, playing video games with some friends, slept in, and then spent the entire day hiding inside with the air conditioning. So if I wanted my miles, nighttime was my only option. I didn't like running with my phone, it bounced, and even a little bit of extra weight annoyed me, so all I took was a cheap old GPS watch and my keys shoved deep into the pocket of my running shorts. Instead of looping the neighborhood, I headed toward the old railroad grade the town had turned into a trail. It cut along the side of the mountain, then crossed the creek on that wooden trestle it'd grown up staring at from our porch. Cars still went under it on the narrow road, but the tracks above were long gone, replaced by a line of warped planks and a rickety railing that everyone used as a shortcut. I liked it because it gave me a good mile or two of relatively flat running and a decent view of the hollow below. On my way out, I passed the community bulletin board nailed to the side of the post office. Even in the dark, my headlamp caught the edge of a missing person flyer tacked up crooked. I'd seen it earlier that week, a local guy in his 30s, last seen hitchhiking on the highway, according to the small print at the bottom. Someone had circled the word "last" in red pen. I don't know why that detail stuck with me, but it did. Stuff like that always made my mom tighten her grip on her coffee mug and say, "This is why we lock the damn doors." I shook the thought off and kept moving. The night was thick with the smell of damp earth and creek water, and the only sounds were my footsteps, the cicadas, and the soft rush of the water below the trail. After a couple of miles, I hit that familiar runner's high, that strange rolling euphoria where your body feels like it's working on autopilot and your brain drifts somewhere else. My shoes thudded against the wooden planks of the trestle in a steady, hypnotic rhythm, and I focused on the silver slice of creek showing through the gaps between the boards. For a while, it was perfect, the kind of quiet, solitary peace I still crave now as an adult. Then I heard it. A faint metallic clink that didn't match my footsteps. I slowed, instinctively patting the side of my shorts, and my stomach dropped when my fingers closed around nothing. My pocket was empty. I stopped dead in the center of the trestle and crouched, heart pounding in my throat. The gaps between the planks were just wide enough to lose something small and important forever, and when I angled my headlamp down, all I saw was blackness. The suggestion of rocks and water far below, and the skeletal outlines of the support beams. The keys were gone. For a second, anger hit me harder than fear. My whole body was buzzing from the run, and suddenly it felt like all that effort had just been wasted. Losing my keys wasn't just inconvenient. It was catastrophic. I knew my parents would freak out. The address was on that tag. Anyone who found them would know exactly where to go. I remember cursing out loud. The words ripped out of me and scattered into the hollow, bouncing off the trees. I looked up and down the trestle, as if the keys might magically appear on the boards. Of course they didn't. Without really thinking it through, I jogged off the side of the trestle to the road, then slid down the embankment toward the underside of the bridge. Underneath, the world felt immediately smaller and wrong. The air was colder and stank of wet wood, stagnant water, and something sour like old sweat soaked into fabric that never fully dried. The beams of the bridge loomed over me, massive and dark, and under them the earth was a mix of mud, rocks, and trash that had washed down over the years. Plastic bottles, beer cans, a half-rotten camping chair, an abandoned tire. I clicked my watch to light up the tiny backlight and used it along with my headlamp, sweeping the ground beneath the spot where I thought the keys might have dropped. Nothing, just the glint of glass and the dull shine of aluminum. I told myself it'd come this far and I couldn't give up now. I started nudging around the rocks and trash with my shoe, scattering cigarette butts and tangled fishing line, trying to ignore how wet and sticky the ground felt through the thin soles. That's when I saw the first thing that made my skin crawl. Near one of the thicker beams, someone had arranged a little pile of bones. At first I thought it was just an animal carcass, but the pieces were too clean, too carefully stacked, small vertebrae, ribs, and a ring of what looked like teeth or maybe claws laid out in a circle. Next to it sat a line of empty pill bottles, their labels peeled off, and a cheap plastic lighter. It was the kind of thing that could be explained, kids messing around. Someone high and bored, but in that moment, under that bridge, it felt like stumbling onto an altar to something I didn't want to understand. I told myself it didn't matter, that I just needed my keys. But my heart had started to pound for a completely different reason. I took a step closer to where the trestle beams met the ground and something crunched under my shoe. When I lifted my foot, there was a small cluster of metal on the ground. Keys. Not mine, but keys. A whole handful of them, on different rings and tags. Some had those little grocery store loyalty cards. Others had colored plastic covers. One had a tag that said Trailer Lot 12. Another had a church logo. They weren't rusty. Someone had put them there recently. For a second, I just stared, my brain refusing to connect the dots. Then a new thought slid in. If these were all lost keys, why were they all in one hidden spot under an old bridge? My mouth went dry. I looked up at the underside of the planks above me, trying to guess exactly where mine would have fallen. The feeling that I was being watched crept up from somewhere low in my spine, but I forced myself not to glance around. Instead, I climbed the embankment back up to the road, jogged onto the trestle again, and stopped where I had first heard the clink. That's when I got the idea with the shoelace. I knelt, untied my right lace, and threaded the end of it between the planks, letting it dangle down into the darkness beneath. The plan was simple. Mark the spot from above, then go back under and look for the hanging lace. For a moment, I felt weirdly proud of myself. Then something yanked the shoelace hard from below. It snapped out of my fingers and vanished through the gap. It wasn't the wind. It wasn't me moving weirdly. It was a definite, deliberate tug. strong enough to burn the tips of my fingers. I froze, hunched there on the boards, listening. The hollow had gone too quiet. Even the cicadas seemed to hesitate. My mind did that frantic split-screen thing, one part screaming at me to run, the other trying to rationalize what had just happened. An animal? No. An animal wouldn't pull a lace straight down like that. Someone was under there, under the bridge, directly beneath me. And if they had my shoelace, they could have my keys too. For a few strained seconds, I pictured myself sprinting home, telling my parents, letting my dad call the sheriff and deal with it. But then, I remembered that metal tag with our address engraved on it, and an image hit me. Some stranger standing on our porch, testing the lock with a key that should have been mine. Heat flooded my chest, equal parts fear and anger. Before I could talk myself out of it, I climbed back down the side of the trestle and ducked underneath it again. This time, everything felt sharper. The smell, the cold, the way the shadows seemed to move just out of reach of my light. I moved slowly, sweeping my watch's faint glow and my headlamp across the ground, searching for the dangling lace. I heard it then, a soft, shuffling sound in the dark, like someone shifting their weight on damp ground. I whipped the beam toward the noise, but it only lit up more beams, rocks, and black hollows where the light didn't reach. I took another step and heard shuffling again, but this time from a different direction, behind me or maybe off to the side. That was when it really sank in that there wasn't just one person down there. The hair on my arm stood up. My breathing went shallow. My brain finally caught up with what my body already knew. This was stupid. I was alone, underneath an old bridge, in the dark, with at least two strangers who clearly didn't want to be seen. The keys were not worth my life. I turned to leave, trying to stay calm, trying not to break into a full-on panic sprint, and that's when something cold and rough clamped around my ankle. Fingers. A hand. It came out of the darkness so fast I barely registered it before pain flared where nails dug into my skin. I screamed a raw, animal sound I didn't recognize as my own, and kicked as hard as I could. My heel connected with something soft and solid, a face or a chest, and the grip loosened. I didn't look back. I scrambled up the embankment on hands and knees, my shins and palms scraping against rocks and splintered wood, until I burst out onto the gravel beside the road. I ran. I ran harder than I have ever run in my life. All the way up the hollow, past the bulletin board with the missing man flyer, past the dark shapes of the houses pressed into the hillside, up the final steep curve to our place. The porch light my mom always left on after dark glowed like a lighthouse through the trees. I went straight to the front door and hammered on it, screaming until my voice cracked. My dad yanked it open, his face twisted in anger that shifted slowly into something else when he saw me, sweaty, shaking, bleeding from my ankle. I spilled everything about the run, the keys, the shoelace, the hand under the bridge, the piles of keys, the bones. My mom appeared behind him, her robe pulled tight, her eyes going wide when she saw the red marks around my ankle, already starting to swell. We called the sheriff's office. They sent a deputy to take a statement, and my dad drove down to the trestle with him while my mom cleaned up my scrapes and made me sit at the kitchen table with a blanket around my shoulders. When my dad came back, he said they hadn't found anyone under the bridge, just trash, some old camping gear, maybe evidence that people had been sleeping there, but nothing they could pin on anyone. The deputy told my parents it was probably transients or addicts camping out. Said they'd keep an eye on it, but his tone suggested he didn't expect much to come of it. The next morning, we had a locksmith change every lock on the house. Front door, back door, basement, even the shed. My dad walked the perimeter twice, checking the windows. For a couple of days afterward, things felt almost normal again. School started creeping closer, my training schedule resumed, and the incident began to fold itself into that part of my brain where you stash bad dreams. I started to think maybe it'd blown it out of proportion, that stress and adrenaline had warped a memory. Then, 3 mornings later, I woke up to the sound of someone pounding on the front door. It was early, gray light barely breaking over the ridge. I lay there waiting for my parents to handle it, but the knocking went on and on, slow and heavy. like whoever was out there had all the time in the world. Finally, I got up, pulled on a t-shirt, and padded down the hall. The house was quiet. My parents were still asleep, or at least their bedroom door was closed. The pounding had stopped, replaced by a silence that somehow felt louder. I crept to the door and looked through the peephole. Nothing, just the empty porch and the half-light of dawn. I almost walked away. I wish I had. Instead, I unlatched the deadbolt and cracked the door, peering out across the yard, down toward the road. No car, no person, just the low ribbon of mist curling along the ditch. I started to close the door, and that's when I saw it, right at my feet on the doormat. A single shoelace, dirty, frayed at one end where it had been yanked. Mine, the one that had been pulled out of my fingers and down through the gap in the trestle. For a second, the whole world seemed to narrow to that one small piece of fabric. My skin went cold, my pulse roaring in my ears. There was a smear of mud on the mat beside it, the faint outline of a boot print that hadn't been there the night before. I slammed the door and threw the deadbolt so hard the frame rattled. We got a security system installed that same afternoon, motion lights, cameras, the whole paranoid package. For weeks after that, every creak of the old house made us jump. My dad started leaving that shotgun out where he could reach it faster. My mom started sleeping with her phone under her pillow. No one ever tried to break in, at least not that we know of. The cameras never caught anyone close enough to identify. Life moved on in that weird way it does, the sharp edges of fear dulling into something you live around instead of getting rid of. But even now, years later, I can't fully rationalize what happened. Someone was under that bridge. Someone had that hidden pile of keys. Someone reached for my ankle and then, days later, walked all the way up our hollow in the dim light of morning just to leave my shoelace on our doorstep, right over the place where my mom always wiped her feet when she came in from the garden. No ghosts, no monsters, just a real person who chose to make their presence known and then disappear. That, to me, is so much worse. I don't live in that house anymore, but sometimes when I visit and stand on the porch looking down at the hollow, I can't shake the feeling that somewhere out there, deep in the trees, or under some other forgotten bridge, someone remembers exactly where we live. If you made it this far, I'm curious, would you have gone back under that trestle for your keys, or turned around and left them there? Tell me what you would have done in the comments, and if anything like this has ever happened to you. Story 2. I don't think of myself as someone with a thrilling life, but whenever people ask me about the one moment that truly rattled me, my mind always drifts back to a winter night in the Appalachians, when I realized how small and vulnerable one person can feel in a place they thought they knew. My name's Casey, and for most of my teens and early 20s, running was how I stayed sane. I grew up in a narrow mountain town wedged between two ridges, the kind of place where the main street is 3 blocks long and everything else is just houses clinging to the hillsides, a church, and a gas station that also sells bait. In summer, the trails around us felt alive, with people hiking, kids biking, pickup trucks bouncing along the old logging roads. But in the off-season, the mountains closed in and the town went quiet. That quiet is what I loved. After a day of dealing with people, I would lace up my shoes, pull on a hoodie, and head out alone. My favorite route was a converted rail trail that followed the side of the ridge for a couple of miles and then narrowed into a gravel path along an old service road, the kind they used to use to get to the fire tower on the far peak. From up there, if you timed it right, you could see the lights of 3 different hollows glittering in the distance like scattered coins, and if you turned your headlamp off, the sky felt impossibly huge. That night, it was late January, the kind of cold that made your breath hang in the air and your fingers ache through your gloves. The town was almost entirely dark when I stepped outside. Most people were already in bed, the only light coming from a flickering TV across the street and the steady orange glow of the sodium vapor lamp by the convenience store. I had one earbud in, more out of habit than anything, playing low music beneath the constant background hum of my own thoughts. My parents had always warned me not to run alone at night, especially after a string of petty thefts and a rumor about someone living out of their car on the forest road. But fear has a way of feeling abstract, until it's right in front of you. Besides, I knew this path. I had run it hundreds of times. At the edge of town, I passed the trailhead kiosk where people posted lost dog flyers and trail conditions. Someone had taped up a new sheet of paper that week. A grainy photo of a man's face, eyes half closed, with the word missing in big black letters. I'd barely glanced at it before, but that night my headlamp caught something I hadn't noticed. Faint knife marks in the wood beneath the flyer, at knee height, where someone had carved "Don't Run Alone" in clumsy letters and then half-scratched them out. I told myself it was just some bored kid and kept going, but a small knot formed in my stomach that I tried to outrun. The first mile passed easily. The crunch of gravel under my shoes synced with the rhythm of my breathing, and the cold air burned pleasantly in my chest. The mountains were just looming shadows on either side, and below the drop-off I could hear the creek far down in the hollow, fast and restless from recent rain. That's when I got the feeling, subtle at first, like a weight shifting in the back of my mind, the sense that I wasn't alone anymore. I tried to shake it off. It's easy to get spooked in the dark, especially when every branch and rock looks like something else in your peripheral vision. Still, after a minute, curiosity won out and I glanced over my shoulder. There, just within the reach of my headlamp, stood a man on the trail behind me. He wasn't walking, he wasn't stretching or pretending to look at his phone. He was just standing there, centered in the path, facing me. He had a hood up and his hands in his pockets, and from where I was, I couldn't catch any details of his face. My brain did a quick calculation. It's probably just another runner, a hiker, someone out getting some air. But people out that late usually announce themselves footsteps, a cough, a quick hey. He didn't do any of that. I turned back around, telling myself not to be dramatic, and picked up the pace. After a while, my music became more distracting than comforting, so I took the earbud out. The winter night pressed in, full of tiny sounds. Branches creaking, the wind whispering through dry leaves, my feet hitting the ground. Then another sound began to braid itself into the mix. So faint at first, I thought I imagined it. Another pair of footsteps, spaced just slightly differently from mine, following the same rhythm. I told myself it was an echo from the ridge, but echoes don't speed up when you do. The knot in my stomach tightened. I waited until I reached a wider section of trail, then risked another look back. The man was closer now, maybe half the distance between us, still standing, completely still, as if he'd been there the whole time. No visible movement, no cloud of breath, just that hooded shape watching me. My skin prickled. There was no way he could have closed that gap without running, and I hadn't heard anyone run. Logic and fear wrestled in my mind. I could turn around and go back toward town, but that would mean passing by him, brushing within touching distance. The thought made my throat close. So I did the only thing that felt remotely safe. I kept going forward, toward the end of the path, where my car was parked in the tiny dirt lot by the old fire road gate. The trail grew narrower and rougher, the packed gravel giving way to uneven ground where frost had heaved up rocks and roots. On my right, the hillside rose steep and dark. On my left, the land dropped away into the hollow. As my headlamp swung, it caught something off in the trees. A rough wooden hunting blind propped up on stilts, just visible through the branches. I'd passed it before, but never really looked. This time, the beam slid across the front opening, and I saw a pair of eyes shine, a flash of reflected light from something inside. For a heartbeat, I thought it was an animal. But then I realized it wasn't two symmetrical points, like a deer or raccoon. It was the single dull gleam of something glass, like a bottle. My light swept lower and caught the curve of a folding chair, a small pile of cigarette butts, and an empty food can, all arranged in a way that said someone had been using this spot to sit and watch the trail. Maybe earlier that day. Maybe every day. Maybe that night. My chest squeezed. I didn't stop to investigate. I just ran harder, the cold air turning sharp and metallic in my lungs. I could hear my own breathing now, ragged and loud. And beneath it, I swore I still heard those other footsteps, never quite syncing perfectly with mine. always a half beat off. Every time my mind tried to convince me I was imagining it, a small rock would skitter somewhere behind me, or a dry leaf would crunch in a pattern that didn't match what my feet were doing. I didn't dare look back again. My world shrank to the cone of light in front of me and the idea of my car waiting like a lifeboat at the trailhead. Finally, the trees thinned, and the faint glint of metal appeared ahead the locked gate that separated the gravel lot from the forest road. Beyond it, in the small clearing, I saw my car, a lonely, dark shape under the pale wash of the single street lamp. Relief hit me so hard I almost stumbled. I fumbled in my pocket for my keys, fingers clumsy from the cold and adrenaline, and hit the unlock button. The car's lights flashed, and that little beep felt like the sweetest sound I'd ever heard. As I got closer, though, something felt off. The driver's side was exactly how he had left it. Doors closed, windows up. But the passenger side door looked just a fraction wrong, not fully aligned. My stomach dropped when I realized it wasn't shut all the way, just barely ajar, as if someone had pulled it closed until the latch almost caught and then stopped. The handle was smeared with a faint, dirty streak, a long fingerprint of mud or grease, like someone with filthy hands had gripped it recently. I knew I had slammed that door shut earlier. It had that stubborn hinge that always took an extra shove. My mind started spinning through possibilities. Maybe it'd been careless. Maybe the latch had slipped, but panic was louder than rationality. Without looking too closely inside, I yanked the door fully open, tossed myself into the driver's seat, and locked all 4 doors in one frantic motion. The interior of the car smelled like cold fabric and my own sweat. I jammed the key into the ignition, hands shaking, and turned it. The engine coughed to life just as a wave of nausea rolled through me. I threw the car into reverse, my eyes flickering to the rearview mirror, half expecting to see the hooded man standing directly behind me. The lot looked empty. The trees beyond it were just a black wall. I backed up anyway, heart pounding, and then shifted into drive, eager to shoot out of there and back to the relative safety of the town's few streetlights. That was when I saw him. As my headlights swung across the lot, they carved a bright arc over the place my car had been parked moments before. In that cone of light, for the briefest second, the man stood exactly where my car had just been, dead center in the space, facing me, as if he had stepped forward the second I moved. His hood was still up, shadowing most of his face, but I saw the pale line of skin around his mouth, the tense set of his shoulders, the way his hands hung loose at his sides, empty. I don't know how long we locked eyes. Maybe it was less than a heartbeat, maybe longer, but it felt like an eternity held taut between us. Then I cranked the wheel, my tires slipping a little on the loose gravel as I lunged the car toward the exit. The beam of the headlights swung away from him, and when I glanced back in the mirror a second later, the spot where he had stood was empty. The drive home is a blur in my memory. Sharp turns taken too fast, stop signs barely acknowledged. My fingers locked around the steering wheel so tightly they ached the next day. I don't remember if I checked to see if I was being followed. I only remember the explosive relief of pulling into our driveway, the way my hands fumbled with the house key, the sound of the deadbolt sliding into place like a lifeline. That night, I didn't sleep. I lay in bed listening to every creak and groan of the old house, every gust of wind against the siding, every far-off dog bark from across the hollow, convinced each one meant someone was outside, waiting. In the weeks that followed, the experience followed me into my dreams. I'd find myself back on the ridge path, running in place while the man stood just out of reach of my vision, always closer when I dared to look, always waiting at the end no matter which way I turned. Sometimes, in those dreams, I'd open my car door and see him already sitting in the passenger seat, hood up, and turned toward me. I stopped running up there in the winter after that. Honestly, I stopped running at night altogether for a long time. People always ask if I reported it, and the truth is, I didn't. What would I have said that a man used the dark and my fear to play some kind of sick game of cat and mouse? No crime was technically committed. He never touched me. But that's what haunts me the most, the intentionality of it. The way he chose silence and stillness and timing to make it clear he knew exactly where I was and how alone I felt. There were no ghosts on that ridge, no monsters in the trees, just a real person using the emptiness of winter in the Appalachians as cover. If you've made it this far, I'm genuinely curious, would you still run alone at night after something like this, or would you hang up your shoes for good? And have you ever had a moment on a trail or a dark road where you suddenly realized you weren't as alone as you thought? Tell me in the comments. I'd really like to know. I'm not the only one who's felt that kind of fear. Story 3. I still think about that bathroom more than I want to admit. My name's Dylan, and this happened when I was 23. During a long weekend, my friends and I spent at a cheap rental cabin tucked into a hollow in the Appalachians, just outside a fading little town that used to be known for coal and now mostly just clung to the river. It was late July, heavy and warm even after dark, and we'd spent the night down by Laurel Creek, where the town had built a small park, just a few picnic tables, a fire ring, and a cracked concrete bathroom that looked like it hadn't seen a fresh coat of paint in a decade. We'd made a fire, passed around cheap beer, and watched the glow of headlights moving along the ridge road far above us. By the time everyone else was heading back to the cabin in a friend's truck, I wasn't tired yet. I felt wired in that specific way you get when you've been laughing too long in firelight. I told him I'd walk back along the Greenway Trail that followed the creek and then cut up to the cabin road. The park was emptying out by then, just our dying fire and the dark outline of the cinder block restroom near the tree line. As I walked past the bulletin board by the entrance, my flashlight caught on a missing person flyer pinned under a rusted thumbtack, a college-aged guy, maybe a year older than me, staring stiffly at the camera. Someone had drawn a rough X over his eyes in pen. Underneath, in faded ink from some older notice, I could still read the words, "Last seen near Laurel Creek Park." I remember feeling a flicker of unease, but I pushed it down. I really had to pee, and I've never been the type to just go behind a tree, especially with houses on the hill across the river. So I pushed the bathroom door open. The smell hit me first. A thick, sour mix of bleach, urine, and something damp and stale that made me want to hold my breath. The fluorescent light inside hummed and flickered, casting everything in a sickly yellow. The walls were scrawled with overlapping graffiti, most of it harmless, but one message by the sinks grabbed my attention. Carved into the concrete in jagged letters were the words, "Don't use the last stall." The last word angrily scratched over, but still legible if you looked long enough. Right beside it, the paint on the wall was darkly stained, like something had been splashed there and scrubbed over and over, without ever really coming clean. I told myself it was probably just kids trying to freak people out. I went to the far end anyway, habit or stubbornness, or both, and took the last stall. The metal door squealed when I pulled it shut, and the latch caught with a dull click. For a minute, it was just the sound of my own breathing and the faint buzz of the light. Then the heavy outer door creaked open. I winced, annoyed to lose the illusion of privacy, and listened to footsteps enter. They were slow, measured, not rushing to a stall, just moving. The footsteps made a slow circuit of the room, a pause by the sinks, a scrape of shoe on concrete as whoever it was shifted their weight, then a soft shuffle past the row of urinals. I stared at the narrow gap at the bottom of my stall door, waiting to see a pair of shoes appear. None did. Instead, the footsteps continued, tracing a deliberate path from one stall to the next. I could hear each door lightly tested, hinges giving soft squeaks, locks rattling. Whoever was out there was checking which doors were occupied. When they reached mine, the door didn't move, but the metal partition vibrated faintly, like someone had placed their hand flat against it. There was no cough, no muttered apology, no sound of another stall door opening, just silence and the faint rasp of breathing close by, too close. I finished as quickly as I could and reached for the latch, ready to get out of there. But when I pushed, the door didn't budge. It flexed outward an inch and then stopped hard, like something heavy was wedged against it from the outside. My pulse spiked. I jiggled the latch, even checked to make sure I had turned it correctly, unlocked. Definitely unlocked, but the door felt like it was being held shut. I leaned my shoulder into it and shoved. Still nothing. Somewhere above me, In the gap between the top of the partition and the ceiling, there was a faint metallic clicking, like a small tool brushing against metal. I looked up and realized there were two tiny holes drilled through the top of the stall divider right by the door. The kind of holes you'd make if you wanted to slip wire or a loop of cord through. On my side, a frayed piece of twine dangled down, cut short, like whatever had once been there had snapped or been removed. I swallowed hard, adrenaline flooding my limbs. I tried to convince myself maybe the old door had just jammed, but the feeling of resistance had weight and intent to it. Then, from the stall next to me, I heard movement. Not the clatter of someone sitting down, but a subtle shift, like a foot adjusting on porcelain. I dropped my gaze to the gap below the wall, expecting to see shoes. There was nothing. No legs, no feet. Whoever was in that stall was standing on the toilet or the seat, staying out of sight. For a long second, the only sounds were my own breathing and the slow drip of a leaky faucet somewhere behind me. Then, from the far side of my door, something dragged lightly down the metal slow, deliberate, like a fingernail tracing a line from eye level all the way to the floor. The sound made every hair on my body stand up. I don't know if it was fear or anger that took over then, but something in me refused to just wait and see what happened next. I backed up, braced myself, and slammed my shoulder into the door as hard as I could. It shook, but held. I did it again and again, feeling the frame groan with each hit. On the third hit, I heard something scrape on the other side, like a block of wood or a boot being jerked away. I threw myself into it one more time, and this time the door burst open, flinging me half into the main room. I stumbled out, caught myself on the sink, and spun around, heart trying to punch its way out of my chest. The bathroom looked empty. The outer door was slowly swinging shut, as if someone had just slipped through it. The stall next to mine was closed, its lock apparently engaged. For a moment, I stood there, frozen between fight and flight. Then I bolted for the exit. When I grabbed the outer handle and twisted, it didn't move. Cold went through me in a wave. The handle didn't even rattle. It felt like it had been locked from the outside, which made no sense for a public restroom. I yanked and shoved, but nothing. Behind me, one of the stall doors squeaked ever so slightly, as if weight had shifted off it. I didn't wait to see if someone stepped out. My eyes shot around the room for another way out and landed on a small, grimy window high near the ceiling above the urinals, half painted over, the glass wavy with age. It wasn't big, but it was big enough. I climbed up onto the sink, which creaked ominously under my weight, and shoved at the window. The paint cracked and flaked under my fingers, but the latch finally gave, and cold night air rushed in. As I started to pull myself through, my shoe slipped on the porcelain and banged against the stall divider behind me. At that exact moment, a stall door slammed open. I twisted to look back, wedged halfway in the window frame. The door of the middle stall had flown inward, and in the dim light I saw a man step out. He was older than I had expected, late 40s maybe. Hair thinning, face almost ghostly pale from living indoors too much. He wore a faded hoodie and jeans that hung a little too loose, and he had the solid, wiry build of someone who did a lot of moving and not a lot of eating. Our eyes met for a single, charged second. His expression wasn't surprised. It was disappointed, like Id ruined something he'd been planning. I didn't say a word. I shoved myself the rest of the way through the window, scraping my back and catching my knee on the sill before dropping hard onto the damp grass outside. Pain shot up my leg, but I forced myself to run, not stopping until I had put a good distance between me and the building. Only then did I call the police with shaking hands. By the time the officers arrived and swept the bathroom, whoever he was had disappeared. They pointed out the fresh gouges around the outer door handle, marks that looked like someone had been slipping something through the gap to jam the lock from the outside. One officer mentioned, almost under his breath, that they'd found a small duffel bag hidden above a loose ceiling tile in one of the stalls. Duct tape, zip ties, an old phone with the camera app still open. He didn't go into detail, but I saw the way his jaw tightened when he told me it'd been smart to get out through the window. I left town the next day and never heard another word about it. No follow-up calls, no news reports, just silence. which in some ways feels worse. It means whoever that man was, whatever had done before or planned to do next, is still out there somewhere. Maybe in some other small town with another forgotten concrete bathroom by a river. To this day, I can't stand locking a bathroom door without checking every possible exit first. So I'm honestly curious, if you'd been in that last stall and felt that door held shut, would you have waited and tried to reason with whoever was out there? Or would you have gone straight through the window like I did? And have you ever had a moment in a public place where you suddenly realized you might actually be trapped with someone who wanted you that way? Tell me in the comments. I'd really like to know I'm not the only one who thinks about stuff like this. Story 4. I'm gonna be honest up front. I was just a kid when this happened, so some details are fuzzy, but the feeling of that night in the mountains will never leave me. My name's Mason, and I must have been 8 or 9, spending one of those long, hazy summers at my grandparents' place in a small Appalachian town that barely shows up on a map. Their house sat on a hill above the river, the kind of old 2-story with a wide porch and too many bedrooms. The unofficial family hub where a rotating cast of cousins, aunts, and uncles crammed in on air mattresses and pull-out couches. Every summer felt like an endless, warm dream. Days spent riding bikes along the cracked pavement, catching salamanders in the creek, and wandering the wooded trails that snaked along the riverbank. That particular summer was different, though. There was talk of a big storm system rolling up from the coast, the kind that dumped serious rain into the mountains and turned rivers vicious. Grown-ups murmured about once-in-a-generation flooding, and the town started prepping months in advance. Down by the river, where there was usually just a narrow strip of rocky bank and the old walking path, they built a huge dirt flood wall, a long, raised berm that cut off the view of the water from the street. To a kid, it looked like the earth had grown its own fortress. From town, you'd normally see the river shining between the trees. But that summer, all you saw was a solid wall of packed clay and sandbags. It changed everything. The river path technically closed after a certain hour, and the sheriff had warned everyone to stay off the bank after dark while they were monitoring water levels, but rules never meant much to the local kids. The town felt safe, almost insular, the kind of place where people left their screen doors unlatched and kids slipped out after sunset as long as they promised to stay away from the deeper water. I was a little troublemaker back then, always pushing the edges of whatever line had been given. And the flood wall felt like an invitation. That evening, the sky was still streaked with late light, the storm days away, and the air buzzing with the sound of cicadas. I'd gotten into an argument with one of my older cousins about something stupid who got the top bunk probably, and instead of cooling off inside with everyone else, I decided I wanted to be alone. My grandparents' house had a sliding glass door on the lower level that opened straight out to the backyard. It was perfect for sneaking out if you were small and quiet. My older cousins had used it for years to slip away to meet friends or smoke down by the river, and I'd watched them enough times to know exactly which board on the deck squeaked and how slowly you had to slide the door so it didn't rattle. I slipped out barefoot, heart thumping with a mix of guilt and excitement, and padded down the hill to the road. I expected to see at least a few people out, dog walkers, fishermen packing up, teenagers killing time, but the town was strangely still. The streetlights hadn't quite flicked on yet, and the houses along the main drag were mostly dark, curtains drawn. As I passed the little bulletin board by the old bait shop, my eyes caught on a missing child flyer taped crookedly under a thumbtack. They'd noticed it before during the day, but never really looked. A boy around my age, maybe a little younger, staring straight at the camera with that stiff school picture posture. His name was printed in bold letters beneath, along with the words, "Last seen near river access." Somebody had drawn a rough circle around that line in red pen, pressing hard enough to dig into the paper and the wood behind it. For a second, I felt a cold, unfamiliar prickle move through me, but I told myself the grown-ups would have mentioned it if it was really serious, and kept walking. The flood wall loomed ahead, taller and more imposing up close than it looked from my grandparents' porch. Normally, from that path, you could glance over and see the river unrolling between the trees, but now it was just a massive hump of earth blocking everything beyond. I followed the path along its base, listening to the muffled rush of water on the other side. That's when I saw it. A thin trail of gray smoke curling up from beyond the top of the wall, dissolving into the darkening sky. At first I thought it was fog or maybe exhaust from some work truck, but the way it rose steady, pulsing, looked more like a fire. Fires by the river happened all the time in the summer. People grilled, lit small campfires, ignored the no open flame signs, and then stamped them out when they were done. What unsettled me wasn't the fire itself. It was how empty everything felt. No voices, no clink of bottles, no music. Just that lonely ribbon of smoke. I should have turned around. I know that now. But my parents had always drilled into us that you never ignored potential danger, that if you saw something wrong, you tried to fix it or at least tell someone. In my 8-year-old brain, an unattended fire near a flood-swollen river definitely qualified as something wrong. I picked a spot a little ways down the wall where the dirt had slumped and started to climb. The surface was rough and crumbly, full of rocks and footprints, some fresh, some almost washed away by earlier rains. At one point, my hand landed on something half buried. A small blue plastic dinosaur with its tail melted and warped, like someone had burned it and then tossed it aside. That little deformed toy sent another chill through me, but I kept going. By the time I reached the top of the berm, my legs and hands were streaked with dirt. I peered over the other side and saw exactly what id expected and somehow dreaded anyway, a bonfire. It burned in a shallow pit near the waterline, flames licking up in orange tongues against the coming night. But there was no one around it. No coolers, no folding chairs, no scattered trash. Nothing that suggested a group of people had just stepped away. Just the fire and the soft slap of the river against the rocks. I slid down the far side of the wall, digging my heels in to keep from tumbling, and walked toward the fire. The closer I got, the more wrong everything felt. The smell wasn't right. It wasn't just wood smoke. There was a sour, chemical edge to it, like burning plastic and fabric. When I reached the edge of the pit, my stomach turned. Inside, half consumed by the flames, were clothes, small clothes, shirts and shorts the size I wore, tiny socks, a pair of sneakers with the rubber peeling away, all blackening and curling in the heat. Mixed in with them were charred scraps of paper, some curling into ash, others just clinging to shape. I grabbed a stick and started pushing dirt onto the fire, my movements clumsy but determined. It felt like the only thing I could do. I kept at it until the flames choked down to smoking embers and finally died, the smoke drifting away in greasy gray ribbons. When it was mostly out, I poked through the remains, my heart pounding in my ears. Up close, the clothes were even more unsettling. One shirt had a faded cartoon astronaut on it, arm raised in a wave that now looked warped and wrong. Nearby, half buried in the damp sand, I spotted a small backpack, the kind kids wore to elementary school. Its fabric melted in places. The name tag on it had been roughly scratched over with something sharp, but if I tilted it just right, I could still see the faint outline of the first letter. The same as the boy's name on the missing child flyer. My throat went dry. I dropped the stick like it had burned me. Among the charred papers, one photo had survived just enough to recognize. The edges were blackened and flaking, but the center held the ghost of an image. A boy standing on what looked like a front lawn. A dented truck in the background. The details were blurry, but the shape of his face, the dark hair, the angle of his jaw, it all reminded me unnervingly of myself. In that moment, some primitive fear grabbed hold of me, primal and absolute. I wanted to run, but my legs wouldn't move. That's when I heard it. A voice, far down the riverbank, calling out sharp and slurred. I looked up and saw a man staggering toward me along the rocks. He was bald on top with a fringe of dark hair around his head, his t-shirt stained, his steps unsteady like he was drunk or worse. Even at that distance, something about the way he moved, like he was fighting his own body to stay upright, made my skin crawl. As he got closer, I could see his eyes fixed on me, hard and unfocused at the same time. I couldn't make out his expression completely, but his whole posture screamed possession, like I was somewhere I absolutely shouldn't be. I froze, watching him weave around a driftwood log, his boots scraping on the stones. He picked up speed, closing the distance faster than his drunken stagger should have allowed. My brain finally snapped back into my body. I turned and bolted toward the flood wall. Behind me, his voice cracked across the water, loud and ugly, and then his footsteps pounded against the ground, chasing mine. The river rocks shifted treacherously under my bare feet, but adrenaline made me sure-footed. I clawed my way up the berm as fast as I could, feeling the dirt crumble and slide under my hands. Just as I reached the top, I felt fingers rake across my ankle, nails digging hard enough to sting. I kicked out blindly, more reflex than intention, and by some miracle he didn't get a solid grip. I threw myself over the crest of the wall and rolled, sliding down the town side in a clumsy, scraping tumble that filled my mouth with the taste of dirt and panic. I hit the path at the bottom hard enough to knock the breath out of me, but I didn't stop. I sprinted all the way back through the empty streets, past the bait shop and the bulletin board with that flyer, past the quiet houses with their drawn curtains and dark windows, until I reached my grandparents' place. I slipped back in through the sliding door, heart hammering, and crawled into bed without turning on a light. I wanted to tell someone. I really did. But all I could think about was how Eid snuck out, how much trouble he'd be in, and how impossible the whole story sounded. No police tape went up by the river the next day. No news vans rolled into town. No one mentioned a fire or a strange man on the bank. Eventually, the storm came and went. The river rose and fell. The flood wall eroded back into the landscape. And that summer slid into the blur of childhood. But every now and then, you'll see a missing person flyer taped to a gas pump or a grocery store door and think about that charred photo of the boy by the truck. His face so close to mine it felt like looking at a variant of myself. I still lie awake sometimes, wondering what I walked into that night and what might have happened if it'd been slower, or if his grip on my ankle had held. If you've read this far, I'm curious if you were that kid. Would you have told your family everything and risked the trouble? Or kept it to yourself like I did? And what do you think was really going on by that fire? Let me know in the comments, because honestly, I still don't know how to live with the version of events I carry around in my head.